stuff, so slightly daunting speaking to you all. I'm going to share my screen and hopefully you can see that. So I'm going to start where Andrew's introduction was around my work as a pioneer minister. So throughout my ministry, I think I found myself bumping alongside the wacky and the ridiculous. And I've started to call them the John the Baptists, the weird ones who kind of live in the desert, saying crazy stuff and eating locusts and honey. And when the church thought it invented the word pioneer, I found a home amongst those these kind of John the Baptist type characters. These were people that could think outside the box. They imagined new worlds, and they enabled new things to come into existence. And at some point during that time, these people either self-identified or were named by others as being prophetic. So to be prophetic, I thought then, was to be a creative, imaginative, not quite understood, you might even call that a mystic, person who was on the margins, who kept disrupting and disturbing the center. I remember a conversation, so we used to meet together as pioneers, and I remember a conversation saying to a fellow pioneer, it was about 10 years ago now, what will we do if we succeed? I said, what will we do if the church becomes the wacky, crazy, creative thing that we have imagined it to be? Will we just become the new center and there'll be other people who become the new prophetics or pioneers? His reply was, well, we'll just keep on moving to the edges because that's what we always do. I remember at the time I was quite uncomfortable with that. And I think I'm even more uncomfortable with it now. It feels kind of full of ego. It feels full of a sense of my own victimhood. Look at me on the margins. And it's kind of mixed with an unhealthy dose of self-righteousness. Hey, everybody, I'm right. But the reality is, I cannot deny that I feel more at home amongst the John the Baptist types than I do in the seats of power. There was and there is something compelling about those people we identify as pioneers. It feels dangerous, it feels exciting, even a little hedonistic. But in some kind of bizarre twist of divine providence, for the last 10 years of my ministry, I've occupied the centre. I worked at Queen's, I'm an academic, a theologian, a member of a number of connectional working groups, and for the last 18 months, I've been a member of the connectional team in this role. So many of the John the Baptists think I've betrayed them, or at least they don't get why I occupy this space. And many of the centre figures just think I'm one of those people that comes up with lots of stupid ideas. It's actually a place I've enjoyed. So that was my relationship to the contemporary prophetic in Methodism. And then recently, Covid-19 has ripped through the world's population, causing confusion, deep grief, disorientation, a sense of dislocation. And for the church, this has meant overnight that we had to shut our doors and we could not meet in people's homes for Bible studies and prayer groups. We could not meet in our church buildings. Literally within 24 hours, the Methodist Church's modus operandi that has served us well, or has it, for more than 50 years, was stripped from us. The results for church leaders, and we learnt this, those that were here in the first session around trauma and grief, the result for church leaders was that some of us felt bereft, mourning all that was lost. Some of us felt that this was a call to action. Let's get on and do things differently. And others felt utterly disorientated, and we're only just finding our feet in this strange new world. But what was interesting was that being prophetic has suddenly become mainstream, particularly for those who saw this crisis as a call for action. So my comments years ago, what happens if the church becomes the thing I imagined it to be, has come true. Lots of church leaders were recognizing that they would have to drop the old oppressive ways of working and could begin to imagine new, imaginative and innovative ways of working. And results were looking good. More people were engaging with worship online than ever before. They were leading to some local and international connections throughout their communities. Churches without buildings were developing new ways to reach their local communities through WhatsApp and Facebook groups. And the church, which had for years been retreating into the private sphere, was finally becoming more public, or at least less private, by being online. On top of that, many church leaders that I've spoken to are enjoying only preparing one act of worship a week, having evenings and weekends freer, and developing new rhythms of life that were more generous, more fruitful, and offered more self-care. And this new way of doing church was the prophetic thinking we had been looking for. It took a crisis. Thousands of people died, but we found it, or so we think. Something's made me a bit suspicious of this being prophetic, I think, during this season, and I couldn't work out what it was. I didn't know if it was my own ego, the child in me crying, I'm the prophetic one, not the rest of you. So I did some theological reflection of my own, and last week Roger Walton helped us recognize theology as a key aspect of a spiritual leader. I'm not saying I am a good spiritual leader, but as a theologian, I wanted to investigate my own sense of unease by digging into the tradition. So I went to look at the prophets themselves and what people had written about them. What I want to know is, can I find within our tradition an understanding of being prophetic that resonates with what I am experiencing today? I did have a head start on this, I have to admit. I'd been leading a theology book club in the Manchester and Stockport district, and we'd been using Walter Brueggemann's brilliant little book, Prophetic Imagination. And Brueggemann helps us, I think, to get a grip on the nature of being a prophet. So he writes, the prophet is called to be a child of the tradition, one who has taken it seriously in the shaping of his or her own field of perception and system of language, who is so at home in that memory that the points of contact and incongruity with the situation of the church in culture can be discerned and articulated with proper urgency. I'll make these slides available at the end so you can see them. Brueggemann suggests that the prophet is earthed deeply in the traditions of their people, both religious and cultural. And this seemed to fly in the face of my previous theory that prophets were on the edge somehow, or marginal. Well, they are, I think, but what I never appreciated about the John the Baptist was just how traditional he was. He was soaked in it, and it was that deep knowing of his religious story that seems to have driven him to the Jordan, calling for the repentance of the Jewish people, his people. This sense of that a prophet is saturated in the stories and rituals and traditions of their community is picked up by another scholar called John Sawyer. So Sawyer writes, however emphatically they may protest their independence from the establishment, their style, their knowledge, and their prominent role in society prove that they belonged firmly to the religious, political, and educational heart of ancient Israel society. What Sawyer's trying to say, I think, is that whatever the way they spoke, the things they spoke about, and the resources they drew upon meant that they were part of the establishment. They were part of what it was to be the religious people. So I think I might have got it the wrong way around. A prophet isn't the wacky one on the edge that can reimagine the world. A prophet is a child of the tradition who recognizes something in their current context that resonates with the ancient stories, the rituals, the truths and myths of their people. And it's the articulation of that recognition that pushed them then to the edges. Perhaps my central role as a member of the connectional team is exactly the space to speak prophetically. And perhaps those called to leadership in the Methodist Church, lay and ordained, are in exactly the right position to be prophetic. Just two things I think I'd want to add to this about the nature of a prophet. Both Brueggemann and Sawyer, both of them say that the prophet also had a deep encounter with God. And it's nearly always this encounter that drives them to act. God is like the kind of divine energy that animates the prophet, and the prophet speaks the words of the Lord. And I think I want to add my own observation that I didn't read in any of the text that I picked up. I think a prophet has a profound love for their people. The people might irritate them, even cause them harm. But in the end, the prophet speaks because they recognize something of God's love for a community, and it compels them to do no other. I'm going to have to admit, and in these closed walls of Zoom, it takes a lot of energy for me to love the Methodist Church. But without it, I just become a kind of sort of ecclesial anarchist, or worse still, an ecclesial terrorist. So, three things that form the nature of the prophet, I think. One, they are children of the tradition. Two, they have a deep encounter with God. And three, they love their people. So if that is who a prophet is, what have I figured out or learned or read about what a prophet does? Well, here again, Brueggemann might be able to help us. So Brueggemann writes, the task of prophetic ministry is to nurture, nourish, and evoke a consciousness and perception alternative to the consciousness and perception of the dominant culture around us. Again, this challenges me because this has helped me to realize that being prophetic isn't simply about coming up with new ways of doing things. In fact, it's not about doing at all. It's about forming a new way of being in the world. It's not about changing habits. It's about changing the way we think about God, faith, church, and world. So at the risk of you all logging out of Zoom, I want to suggest that putting worship on the internet isn't being prophetic. Remember, I am one of you. I love you. Shifting our worship from one platform to another is about doing. The prophetic task is to ask why we worship, who is worship for, and who gets to participate. It is the answers to those questions that will inform our return from exile, if we want to use that phrase. The same is true of our patterns of working and the use of our church buildings. Just doing the same things differently isn't prophetic. It just means you are good at your job. Being prophetic is a wholesale reordering of the now into a godly future. I never really understood that when I was a pioneer. But it does explain why the prophets were driven to the edge, I think. Nearly all of us would rather stay or go back to an oppressive state that we know, rather than travel in the wilderness to a promised land we don't know. When the prophet calls, there will be resistance, both from the oppressive forces and from those who fear the unknown. At this point, I want to briefly raise an issue that I've not been able to resolve myself, and I've talked about it with other people, but I think it's in relation to this new consciousness. It's about who is the intended audience of the prophetic utterances by the prophet. So in the last 10 years of my ministry, the general consensus, I think, that I pick up is that the church speaks to the world. And this is particularly true in the kind of Christian socialist bubble that I inhabit online in particular. But my reading of the prophets and of prophecy suggests that the audience isn't the world at all. It's not the nations in the Old Testament, and it isn't Rome in the New Testament. But the religious community itself is the audience. I think there's probably a lot more I would want to say about that, but we won't have time, and it might come up in the discussions maybe. But the only way I've managed at the moment to square that circle, I think, is to suggest that the prophet speaks to the church in order that the church can speak and be a symbol in the world. I think that's how I can live with it at the moment. I'll leave that hanging. So anyway, the next question I pondered was about when a prophet should speak, or more acutely, when does God raise up such people? Again, Brueggemann might be able to help us out. This time, not from his prophetic imagination, but from his magisterial work, Theology of the Old Testament. So he's writing, they is about the prophets, that they characteristically perceive their time and place as a circumstance of crisis, a context in which dangers are great and life or death decisions must be made. Or perhaps it's better to say that the appearance and utterance of the prophets evokes a crisis circumstance where none had been perceived previously. That is, the prophets not only respond to crisis, but by their abrupt utterance, they generate crisis. The opening of that paragraph is easy for me to live with, I think. The devastation of Covid-19, the lockdown of most of the world, and the results of this on church life, particularly its worshiping and pastoral life, has been the crisis that has prompted the prophet. But the latter part of this quotation is deeply disturbing, and something I want to return to, I think, later. If the prophet speaks, if they act on what the Lord has given them, if they respond to the call, then they will not solve a problem. They will exacerbate it, or at least create a new paradigm of crisis. If I ask those questions about the divine reordering of church life and worship that I mentioned earlier, I will be complicit in a new crisis of God's making. No wonder most of the prophets were terrified, reluctant, suffered their own sense of trauma. This crisis that is evoked can be understood by exploring what the prophet has to speak. So what are the utterances that they speak? So there's two things that we're going to look at, and here's the first. I believe that the proper idiom, Brueggemann writes, for the prophet, in cutting through the royal numbness and denial, is the language of grief. The rhetoric that engages the community in the mourning for a funeral they do not want to admit. It is indeed their own funeral. This is the bit I never got when I was a pioneer, and this is the toughest for me part of being a prophet, I think. The naming of grief and the practice of mourning. I assumed back then that the prophetic was simply about imagining new ways of doing things and getting others to catch the vision. But I think in this season of lockdown, I've come to recognize that it's more about naming the grief and the horror around us, as much as it is about the stuff that I'll talk about after this. So let's not try to sanitize the horror of COVID-19, or the experiences of lockdown for some, or the experiences of Christians in our, who are having to practice differently from the way they did 6 weeks ago. Let's name the absolute pain, torment, and grief that we are witnessing in the US. And let's begin to mourn the death of the Methodist Church, or at least it's dying. The prophet's task isn't to build up the community so that they have the energy to do the next new thing that we've come up with. The prophet's task, according to Brueggemann, is to enable a community that can no longer be the same to name that loss, to offer rituals of mourning, to critique the oppressive powers that hold the community in its state of torment, So yes, let's name and critique the church's complicity in racism, homophobia, sexism. Let us name our codependence on an oppressive capitalist regime that denies most of us our full humanity. But let us also grieve that those very things have cost the lives of millions. And if we are to escape them, it will cost most of us, possibly more than we are willing to pay. But all is not lost. The task of the prophet is also to announce hope. In the end, the prophet believes that God's future is a better future, that the worst thing is never the last thing, that resurrection will follow death, and that life is the primary intention of God in creation. Brugman writes, hope is the primary prophetic idiom, because the prophet speaks to a people who willy-nilly, I love that phrase, who willy-nilly are God's people. Hope is what this community must do, because it is God's community invited to be on God's pilgrimage. And as Israel is invited to grieve God's grief over the ending, so Israel is now invited to hope in God's promises. We can't rush here. Many of us were not ready to celebrate Easter Sunday this year and wanted to remain in Easter Saturday. But Easter Sunday does come, but it will not look like the days before it. This alternative consciousness is a daring attempt to imagine the unimaginable and to witness the unrecognizable in what used to be the Garden of Despair. At some point, when we have mourned the loss, the prophet will need to lead us out into a new place for us to inhabit. They will have to dig deep into the tradition to find the traces of God speaking to this new world. Let me give you an example. And this is me now daring myself. I recognized that when I was doing all this research and thinking around the business of being prophetic, I only had white male authors to engage with. So I sent out an email to a couple of people who know more about this than I do, and they sent me back a whole raft of brilliant articles and books to read. And for those who want to read more, the Book of Queer Prophets came out last week, that was one of the books, and we've got 3 Methodists in that book. An article that caught my interest was by Susan Ackerman. And she recognizes that the whole world of prophets in the Old Testament in particular is dominated by men. And so wants to explore how 5 women get to bear the title prophet in the feminine form. So those 5 women are Miriam, Deborah, the wife of the prophet Isaiah, Huldah, and Noadiah. Each of them are named prophet in the feminine form. How do we end up finding these 5 women in a world dominated by men? So she draws on the work of 2 other academics, Joanne Hackett and Carol Mayers. Both of these women recognized that women came to dominance during particular periods of Israelite society. So this is what she writes about Carol Mayers. Israelite women of the pre-monarchic era, so before the monarchy, could have been integrally involved in the community's economic, social, political, and cultural affairs. This because in pre-monarchic Israel, the household was the central institution for most economic, social, political, and cultural aspects of human existence. And because ethnographic evidence specifically indicates the vital and active role that females play in societies in which the household is the base unit of production and consumption. And they also identify other times when women's voices were more dominant. And these were times of unrest. Oh no, so, sorry, this is another bit. So this is where they recognize that something else happens when we become more public. So during periods of Israelites' history where economic, social, and political and cultural matters were dealt in a more public realm, an arena separated and differentiated from the domestic spheres, women's status and potential for the exercise of power declined. So they recognise that when we become more domestic, these voices were raised up, and what they do is they identify these times for these particular prophets. But they also identify another period of time. So Joanne Hackett says, she speaks persuasively of the potential for an elevation in the amount of status and power available to women during times of social dysfunction. And in the article herself, Susan Ackerman speaks of times of periods of war in countries and the way in which the role of women changed during periods of war. I find this fascinating. I find it fascinating because I recognise that we are in a period of unrest, of social dysfunction. Our churches have had to become more domestic because we have lost the use of our public spheres. And I can't help but wondering, have we stumbled into something that God has been up to many times before? Is the new consciousness that we have to contend with a shifting away from public gatherings in the way that we had them into a more domestic space? Is the home now the place where we practice our habits and rituals of faith? If it is, then there will be much mourning, and we will evoke our own crisis, not least for those of us who are ordained. Will the church need me to have a stipend and a lovely manse in this new world? And will we liberate voices that have been previously silenced because of our oppressive ways of being in the past? You don't have to believe that this has come from God. But I do want you to notice what I did. I read my context. I dug into my tradition to see if I could find something that resonated. I took what I had received and I applied it to my world. I named the horror and I hinted at the hope. I think if we are going to be prophetic during lockdown and afterwards, I suspect that that is something of the process and the task that lies before us. I'm going to end it there. I have some questions for you to, I'm going to invite you to think about. There's a lot of them, so I don't want you to think about all of them, and they'll get typed up into the chat function. But the first two in particular, it'd be good to hear what you want to talk about. In what ways is God inviting you to be prophetic, and what is God offering you as the alternative consciousness? And then you might have time then to get onto one of the other questions, and you don't have to do them in order, but pick one that kind of resonates for you out of those other questions. If you get time to do them all, even better. But at that, this prophet is going to lie on his side like Ezekiel or somebody. Thank you. I can't stop.